Right, welcome. Right, so welcome to today's meeting, and I will read the usual announcement. This is a public meeting and members of the public and press are permitted to report on the proceedings. Reporting includes filming, photographing, making an audio recording and providing commentary on proceedings. Please note this meeting is recorded and streamed live. These recordings are published on the relevant meeting of the Council's website. By choosing to attend this public meeting, you are deemed to have given your consent to being filmed or recorded and for any footage to be broadcast or published. If the alarm sounds, the premises must be evacuated immediately. Do not spend time collecting personal belongings. All emergency escape routes are clearly signed. Once you've left the building, the assembly point is in the High Street opposite the Guildhall. Members and other speakers are reminded to use their microphone when speaking. Thank you. So any appointments of substitutes? No. Thank you. And declarations of interest? No. Thank you. And public participation? No. And if we can refer to the minutes of the last meeting, I'll just run through page by page. So page 1, page 2, page 3, and 4. Yep, so we all happy to agree the minutes? Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Right, so the first item, if we go to agenda item 5, it's the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman Annual Review Letter. And we're here to consider the report. And is Sean, do you want to? I'll let Sean take us through, just briefly.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we've had the Ombudsman's annual review letter. It was a little delayed, so that when we last met in July, the review letter hadn't actually arrived. So you're now reading that and receiving that, but you'll note it relates to the year 1st of April 21 to 31st of March 2022. The LGSO was a little bit behind on reporting outcomes following COVID. Now that's well and truly in the past and they're caught up, but this slight lag is a legacy of that, and the fact that we've not met as a committee since last July. So in terms of the details in here, you will have considered them before as a committee when they have come through. We ended up at the outcome being in a scenario where the local government ombudsman during 21 to 22 had investigated only 2 cases. The local government ombudsman had investigated 2 cases in 2021 and no cases in 21-22. So you probably recall, committee, we discussed before the happy occasion of being a council in 21-22 that had 0 maladministration findings against us. So fingers crossed that was a very good place to be. And obviously now we're in March, there will be a slight time lag again, 3 months at least before we get the outcome of the current year that we're in. But you'll see from the next report that there aren't any complaints that I can report on yet in this period. So it's possible that as we come to the end of March, we'll have another clean bill of health for the year that we're currently in.
Thank you. And does anyone have any comments or questions?
Thank you. This is a comment I've made on many meetings before, and I know there's absolutely nothing you can do about it, but I'll make the comment again, just so I feel better. When you look at these things and it says referred back for local resolution, closed after inquiry, incomplete, invalid, advice given, and so on, we don't know what the hell these are about. I mean, it could be somebody broke a paperclip or stole a car, you know. Is there some way we could sort of add something to these that shows the gravity of what we're talking about? Is it serious? Is it just, you know, not really worth discussing?
Through you, Chair. Well, every complaint that finds its way to the local government ombudsman, there is a case file that sits behind it within the council. So absolutely, we can provide to members of this committee a more fleshed out report. I would propose to do that as an exempt paper or just as an information item circulated to committee, because a number of them, where they're local resolution, they haven't been sort of redacted for personal data. But the committee has a right to know information about the management of complaints. So we can provide a summary and reassure you that it is more, as you say, minor issues that have been resolved through local resolution. So I'm happy to provide a sort of like, almost like a tabular summary of what they were, if that would be helpful. Okay.
Thank you. Any further comments or questions? No. So if we take that forward as an action. Thank you. Right, that brings us neatly on to agenda item 6, which is the report of the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman. And we're here to note any complaints which have been received, obviously, and the upheld decisions. But yeah, if I can refer you to Sian again.
Thank you, Chair. Well, just to note that the committee last met in July, and since the last report, there have been no complaints upheld against the council. That's not to say there aren't a couple of things in the pipeline that the council is currently in discussion with the Local Government Ombudsman about, and I've briefed Chair and Vice Chair about that. But there have been no complaints upheld against the council since July 2022, as I sit here today.
Thank you. Any comments or questions on item 6? No. Thank you. Okay, item 7, complaints made under the Members' Code of Conduct. And again, we just need to note this report, which is rather brief.
Thank you, Chair. Because this is a public item and it isn't a function of the full committee to consider all complaints, the reason that these reports are provided consistent with the Local Government Association guidance is to give committee assurance that processes are in place and to give a sense of, I guess, the quantum of work. There are 4 complaints within the period from July 2022 to the present day. One was referred to a standard subcommittee hearing. The subcommittee were Councillor Alcott, Councillor Roberts, Councillor Lamb, and the subcommittee met in, I think, November, and the outcome was no breach of the code, complaint dismissed. Complaint 2 is referred for informal resolution. Complaint 3 is under assessment at the time of writing this report. Complaint 4, there was no breach of the code established and the complaint was dismissed. That's all I'm able to say in the public part of the meeting.
Thank you. Does anyone have any comments before we move on? Thank you. So if we now move on to the ethical standards update, we've got a couple of items to agree, to recommend, and also some to note. Obviously, we've got the council for adoption, and this continues on from the previous meeting back in July. And as well as that, we've got to agree to recommend to approve a number of general dispensations, but we can debate that obviously and note the other points. But I think, Sian, if you can take us through the update, which is quite detailed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, again, as a function of having not met since July, this report is a covering umbrella report which brings together a number of strands, and so hence it's an ethical standards update generally. I think, you know, starting with perhaps the most important here, at our July 2022 meeting, we discussed the benefits of still being able to have a code of conduct that applied across Worcestershire. So when we discussed that in July 2022, with a version in front of us that was the new Local Government Association's model code of conduct, with a couple of modifications suggested by the Worcestershire Monitoring Officers Group, for example, around the level for gifts and hospitality and amplification on a couple of points, but not a lot of change. We were hoping in July 2022 we would have one code for everybody. Well, the position since then is that everybody has adopted or wishes to adopt the LGA model code, sometimes with those couple of local modifications, sometimes not. And so, as I say in the report, I think it's the case now that Worcester City should take a pragmatic approach and adopt one version or the other, which is a function of full council, and simply keep it under review with the prospect it may be possible to harmonise around a single version again in the future. But what I would say is that the changes between us now are very minor, and so I wouldn't want the committee to have the impression that we're all doing radically different things. We're all adopting the LGA model code, sometimes with a bit of additional context, sometimes not. So that's where we stand. So having this committee recommended previously that that code should be adopted, I bring it back because there was an aspiration to try and get the same code everywhere, and the cards have fallen where they have, and I think it's just now time to get it adopted so that it's now in effect for the new municipal year. So I therefore, Chair, I recommend it to you on that basis. That's the first point. So I'm happy to either take them individually or collectively.
Should we take them individually and just, yes.
Thank you, Chair. Correct me if I'm wrong, and if I'm out of order or not speaking on the right thing, I'm sure you'll tell me. A slight concern about this report, and it may be just my own personal confusion in it. Having read it through, and it was quite a lengthy document, and obviously it's important because we're talking in terms of having it on the record for 4 years and setting stone and so on and so on. But when I looked at the Appendix 1, for example, it then goes on to say government response to the Committee on Standards in Public Life, etc., etc. On page 11, we then see there are a large number of recommendations, and there's a narrative under each one. Now, am I correct in assuming, Madam Chair, that the narrative under each recommendation is what the government is saying? In other words, that's the government's response to it. That's my first question, just so that I know what we're talking about.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Amos. Absolutely, I've got an item on that within this paper. So forgive me if my umbrella approach has been a bit confusing, but the government's response to the Nolan Committee's work is definitely something for discussion under this agenda item, but I had just started with the Code of Conduct. So I'm happy to come on to that if people would prefer, but I suppose it's confusing just because I've appended so many things to one report, perhaps, isn't it? So forgive me.
I'll be guided by the Chair.
So if we just go through, in order, and we'll come back to that one if that's okay.
So on the code, the code we debated at the July 2022 meeting, but we need to take it full council for adoption. But I brought it back because I wanted the committee to know we're not exactly as one mind across Worcestershire. The differences are marginal, but the differences were highlighted in the last draft. So it's my recommendation that we take the version that the committee approved and we put that on full council's agenda for March. That's the first recommendation.
Yeah, that is. I think just to mention alongside of that, obviously at Worcestershire County Council, they now have a new monitoring officer as well, and so I think where work would have been not completed before, it will be now, and I can confirm the differences are very minor between the councils. So does anyone have any questions, or are we happy to recommend?
Thank you, Chair. This is the right point. Yes, I mean, if we're on the Members' Code of Conduct, which is actually what I just like to make a few comments and have a few questions on, if I may. And I'll only just a few, because we don't want to rewrite history. But, for example, if we're looking at recommendation 16, again, I'm assuming the narrative is the government's response, because it says here, the Standards Board regime allowed politically motivated and vexatious complaints and had a chilling effect on free speech within local government. These proposals would effectively reinstate that flawed regime, which I agree with. And it then goes on in the next paragraph to say, it would be undesirable to have a government quango to police the free speech of councillors. And I couldn't agree more. I don't think the central government is in any position to lecture us on standards of probity and integrity. Any central government, frankly. It would be equally undesirable to have a council body sitting in judgment on the political comments of fellow councillors. Again, very sensible, because that's why we have a political arena. Politicians will agree. The whole point of politics is that they resolve them without violence and so on. Now, is that, for example, Madam Chairman, is that incorporated in the Code of Conduct? Because I can't see where, and it could be my fault, that is included in the Code of Conduct. Because if it isn't, I wouldn't be happy with it. If it is, I would think that's very sensible.
I would say it is balanced out in the code, but I think if we'd want the detail more from Sian. But
Yes, I mean, I guess just to orientate ourselves within the papers, the government's response to Lord Evans, chair of Nolan Committee, has been a long time coming. And in the meantime, the Local Government Association got on and developed a model code of conduct. And so recommendation 1 from the Nolan Committee to government was the LGA should create an updated model code of conduct. And that's what the LGA have done. So by the time the government write back to Lord Evans, the LGA are sort of up and running with the model code. The LGA in doing that cannot interfere with the legal positions as stated in the law. So for example, so they can only act within the Localism Act, the Human Rights Act and all the other framework. So therefore they can only and have only produced a code which reflects current legal principles. They have and had no power to, you know, sort of put enhanced sanctions in the code or change anything about the Human Rights Act, Article Freedom of Expression or anything like that. So the code is always subordinate to those principles. So hopefully that strikes a note of reassurance. So the work that the LGA have been able to do has been, you know, under the current law. But the reason for the debate between Lord Evans and the Nolan Committee and the government was Lord Evans was saying, well, we think the Localism Act should be amended in several places. And of course, if the government accepted that, that could in time cause changes to the Code of Conduct. But when the government writes back in this response that we've got here in the papers, the Department of Levelling Up letter that I've appended, the government isn't proposing to change the legislation, except in one respect, which is to enhance councillor safety in terms of publication of personal addresses. That's the only legislative change. They say, okay, we'll go ahead and make that. And in all other respects, they say they will keep things under review. So, yes, so hopefully that's answered your question, Councillor Amos, that where these recommendations have been made, they haven't resulted in any changes to the Code of Conduct because the government has said we don't want to make those legislative changes.
Thank you, Chair. I think that does actually clarify the situation a bit. So the framework within which we are considering this is the same because the legislation is the same. So that is helpful then, because presumably if I were to say to you, could you just summarise in 2 minutes the main changes to what we've got and what we're going to have, presumably you could do that.
Yes, so thank you. So the main benefit of moving away from the old Worcestershire Code to the LGA's code is around clarity, simplicity and plain English, actually, as opposed to changing any balances, because it's all being conceived under the Localism Act, the first version, this version, etc. So for example, the code gives examples now of what respect might be. It gives more examples of bullying and it links to the ACAS definition of bullying, which, so in the employment context, well, our code always did that, not always, but has done that recently. So the LGA version does that too. It gives clearer guidance on declaring interest, but it can't change the rules around declaring interest because they come from the Localism Act. So it can only really, you know, write them out and try and explain them. Where the LGA code is very helpful is it sort of sets again some sort of charter standards at the start, like I will always act within the law and I will act with integrity, and it's got a sort of plain English navigation as you go through it. So we did, as a committee, debate, you know, previously the benefits of moving away from what we had now, you know, the sort of old Worcestershire Code, because we did recognise that there wasn't any appreciable change with the LGA code, but it is clearer. And it does come with the benefit then that we're following the LGA's guidance. And again, to sort of to burden your agenda, I did then append the Local Government Association's guidance on the model code. So you can see that by falling in line with their wording, their formatting, their layout, you get the benefit of then following their guidance on some of the points, whether that be respect or equality or declaration of interest. And in balance, I don't know if any long-serving committee members would care to help me out, but that's what I recall being our main reason for moving to the code, was we could keep step with the guidance as it was issued then, as opposed to changing the rules.
Does that, yeah.
I think, yeah, with the committee's indulgence, I think we're getting there, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe other colleagues who understand all this. So we're looking at then the code of conduct as it is going to be. Ms. Stroud has said that we're operating with the same framework because the legislation hasn't changed. I get all that. And she's outlined the changes, which actually seem perfectly reasonable. I don't have any problem with those. But in that case, perhaps I could just make a comment, because it talks about training and all the rest of it. Well, I don't mind going to training. I don't mind not going to training, frankly. But there seems to be and Mr. I would like to comment on this. Some people, I fear, over many years, see the code of conduct as an excuse or an opportunity to have a go at political opponents. Now, I can say, quite in all integrity, I haven't done that, and I don't do that, because we're in politics, we're politicians, and our judgment is that of the electorate, which comes around automatically, whether we like it or not. So that is our judgment. Of course, if something is illegal, then that supersedes the code of conduct, presumably. It's a matter for the courts. So we're kind of this grey area. But what does bother me is that some people think, nobody in this room, I hasten to add, thinks that if they don't like what somebody else says, you make a complaint under the code of conduct, and you go through it and you find a hook. Oh, well, I don't like what he or she said. Oh, I'll go to the code of conduct. I need a hook. Oh, there's the hook. And then we have this relatively expensive and time-consuming exercise by officers, taking advice, coming back, meetings, all the rest of it. And that, I think, I would suggest, Chair, is something where you need to include in any training that we do. Because I don't think, certainly for some new members, or perhaps for some existing members, that message has got through. The code of conduct, unless I'm wrong, I stand to be corrected, is not there for politicians to use against other politicians because they don't want to engage in the political debate or in the political arena. And that I do feel strongly about, because I think officers and members have wasted a lot of time on doing that. And it's quite wrong. And those members should be brought to book, frankly, if they're doing this. And some members do, and I won't name them, either here or anywhere else, but I think we know who we're talking about. So I would welcome Ms. Stroud's comments on that, because it is a waste of officer resources.
Yeah, Councillor Amos, thank you for your comments. And I think obviously we do have the code of conduct, we have what we have, and we have the powers limited that they are. And I think with any sort of piece of legislation, it is designed to do one thing, but as with anything, people may or may not choose to react differently around that. But I do think, and later on we will be talking about the importance of training, and we've got some updates, for pretty soon in the future, which we'll hope will enhance, will enhance sort of, well, not enforcement, but the process. And we're certainly keen to encourage more training, make sure people do really, undertake and partake and do fully understand the code as best they can. Thank you. Councillor Howard.
Thank you, Chair. I think the number of complaints that we've had under the current complaints system suggests that most councillors are using the complaints procedure appropriately. But I do take the point, and perhaps when, assuming that we're going to agree what's in front of us, when we get to full council, I think it would be helpful to underline the point that's just been made, and also at the same time highlight the big differences between what we have and what we're agreeing, because there's a lot of material there. And I think at full council, it would be useful, with a load of other papers to read, for 35 members to have a summary of the salient differences between what we have and what we're agreeing. So, because otherwise, 60-odd pages. So.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so I'm bitterly regretting bringing an umbrella item, and I won't do it again. Because when we go to full council, we won't be referring these appendices. What we will be taking is the new model code of conduct, which was considered at the last Standards Committee meeting. The other appendices here are for your guidance as a committee, with your heightened level of interest in standards, to understand the ebbs and flows in the background of the things that support the application of the code, I won't scare the horses and take all that to full council. Going back to the code itself, we had a conversation in our pre-meeting about the best way to discuss, and if council approved, to sort of launch the idea of the new code at full council. And Councillor Alcott and Councillor Roberts might want to again help me on this, but we talked about whether, if this is adopted at full council in March, somebody might like to speak on it and list out the principles, not read the whole thing, and it isn't that long, but the overarching principles. And that could be the monitoring officer or chair or vice chair of standards, just to set the scene as we go into the new municipal year with the new code. The only other point I want to make is later on the agenda, I have an amendment, I have a set of markups to our procedures for assessing complaints to try and bring a bit more rigour into that process. And that includes a screening stage for things which can be filtered out, a more robust screening stage for things that can be filtered out. So hold that thought, because we will come back to that point about things that shouldn't progress through the code. Okay, so.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. That's really just following up Councillor Lawrence's point, which I think is very valid. I mean, he was agreeing with me, so obviously I now agree with him. And it doesn't often happen that way. But I think it would be sensible, because I'm very glad that we're not going to have all this documentation to full council. Council on 35 members, I mean, could be there all night. But the point is, I think there will be members not on this committee who will say, okay, well, what are the differences then? Yeah. So I think to have a checklist of just the main differences, so that members, to focus the debate, if we're going to have a debate about it, it needs to be focused on what we're supposed to be deciding. And I think if members don't have what's new and what's old, then there will be a very amorphous debate, which probably won't be of much value. So I would urge that we do have something to highlight to other members, not on this committee, what the differences are.
Thank you. Yeah, and obviously we have some members here who are quite experienced, some who haven't been on standards for that long, and not everyone will have that knowledge. So yeah, that does make perfect sense.
So that's just the first recommendation.
Yeah.
Shall I carry on?
Yeah, so shall we, before we go any further, are we all happy to agree 1.1? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So just following up then, the second item is, again, as I said, the ebbs and flows of the debate around standards. The Nolan Committee, colloquially known as the Nolan Committee, the Committee on Standards in Public Life, they are an active committee. They have a website, they have a blog. They publish lots of stuff about standards on public life at all levels. Local government is obviously therefore only one of their areas of interest. But they did do a review which looked specifically at standards in local government, and we're going back some time now. This committee considered that. We actually made a response like other councils did. And as I said, it's been some time that the government's given its response. The minister in charge at the time that this letter was written in March was Kemi Badenoch. And again, things have moved on since then, haven't they? Anyway, the recommendations of the Nolan Committee, the government walks through them and says, model code of conduct, yes, we agree. Candidates' home addresses, we think it would be good if there was a way in the law for people to not have to disclose their home addresses in the process of declaring interest, because at the moment the test in the law is very, very high. There has to be a genuine concern for your safety related to your occupation, basically, and it's not a broad enough test. So that's really good, I think, that they've recognised that, because we talked before, when we had the training for councillors on personal safety, and there were 15 councillors came to that session in the Guildhall about 6 months ago now, this point came up about, it's odd in modern day that you're still expected to publish your personal addresses. So I think that's really good that they have to change the law to make that go away, but I think that's a really good point that they are listening to. The government has said they don't want to change the law in relation to whether people are acting in their official capacity on publicly accessible social media. They think it's for local authorities to determine it. We have the LGA guidance on it. I'll come on to that. And the LGA's position is it is not clear cut that if you are on social media as councillor, all of your conduct is definitely within the scope of the code. It's more sophisticated than that. It depends what you're saying, the context within which you're saying it, and so forth. But anyway, to cut a long story short, the government said, we don't want to legislate on that. We want that to be on a case-by-case basis. And so it goes on. I don't want to read out each of the recommendations, But what I did want to reassure you about is where they were things that we could implement ourselves, we have done so. So, for example, there was a recommendation in here that in the cases of whistleblowing, contact details should be given for the external auditor so that the council's external auditor could be contacted over a whistleblowing matter. And again, the Audit and Governance Committee received from me a revised whistleblowing policy just before Christmas, and we added the external auditor in there as another party. So where we can, we've followed the recommendations, but where we can't, it's a change of the law, and that's a matter for government. And government have decided that there are no legislative changes they want to make, so no more sanctions under the standards regime. Just effectively continue to operate the code at a local level. And no more enhanced powers for the local government ombudsman. So, you know, the matters are dealt with within the council through the process of the ombuds, through the process of the monitoring officer, the independent person, which is a statutory role, with referral to members in the form of standards and standard subcommittees. So no additional role for the local government ombudsman. So I don't really think there's much more to say, except that this is an ongoing, albeit slow dialogue, and maybe more will come out in the future. And the Nolan Committee still feel, and I've quoted Lord Evans in my covering report in December, saying we still don't think local government ethical standards goes far enough, and we'd like it to go further. So, you know, that's their position, which they're on record as saying. So that's all I had on item 2, really, was just to give you that update. The third item is to note the latest Local Government Association guidance and case law on the application of Code of Conduct. So I wouldn't have expected you to have read the LGA's comprehensive guidance, but I wanted to bring it to you so that you can see what the LGA are doing to track these issues. It is a chunky guidance, and it is something then that the monitoring officer, the independent person, and standards subcommittee and standards committee can refer to when considering ethical standards matters. It gives examples, it gives scenarios. As is often the case with scenarios, it doesn't give exactly the scenario that you'd like it to. You know, case study wise, it's kind of sort of there, but not quite. So there's always going to be judgment case by case. And then the other thing to say is that it is a set of local procedures which we adopt as part of our constitution, and therefore it is subordinate to UK law, and it will always be. And so a piece of relevant law is the Human Rights Act. And so I bring to you, again, because this committee's considered cases before, you lucky things, but I bring to you the latest case, which is Robinson versus Buckinghamshire Council, which was reported on in January 2023. And it's another Article 10 case, which means it's another case that establishes councillors' enhanced rights of freedom of expression. And it underscores the point that whenever there might otherwise be a breach of the Code of Conduct, that will be subordinate to human rights like Article 10, freedom of expression. It's this little appendix here, Appendix 3. I'd recommend you read it if you want to. There's some procedural stuff about perceived unfairness between two councillors in terms of the Code of Conduct approach. But ultimately, it's about the High Court's closing remarks about the effect of Article 10. This would be of interest to our parish council colleagues, because this was criticism that the councillor was making about the parish council's disposition towards development allocations in the Greenbelt, and the councillor was saying some things which were quite damaging to the reputation of parish councillors, saying, well, they would vote for stuff in the Greenbelt, and they're happy to have development in their Greenbelt, and they're predetermined, they'll vote this through. And the court said the claimant was entitled, so that's the councillor, the subject councillor, was entitled to an enhanced protection afforded to the expression of political opinions on matters of public interest, and the benefits of freedom of expression in a political context outweighed the needs in this case to protect the reputation of the other councillors against public criticism, notwithstanding that the criticism was found to be misrepresentation, untruthful and offensive. So, you know, I'll just leave you pondering. But that's the latest case. So I'll just bring that to you, just as a reminder that jurisdictionally, we don't just have to look at the Code of Conduct, we have to look at how it's impacted by things like the Human Rights Act. Okay, so assuming you're all still wide awake and following, I should go on to the next thing, which is member training. So recognising that this is quite complex and recognising that, you know, we all want to get it right, the Worcestershire Monitoring Officers Group think it's time for some refresher training. We did deliver refresher training about 3 years ago now, but we want to do that on a Worcestershire-wide basis. We've procured the services of Bethan Evans, who is a former Monitoring Officer Deputy Chief Exec. If you look her up, you'll see she's one of the leading lights in governance and ethical standards training. She will offer 2 sessions, initially 2 sessions. We can always schedule in more if we need. It's the same content, but in the first instance delivered face-to-face, 6 p.m. County Hall, Wednesday the 28th of June, followed by Monday the 8th of July, online via Teams. And that's an open invite to all members serving across Worcestershire. So we will obviously push that and promote that and try and get a good attendance for that. She's very well rated for her approach to training because it is interactive. She does talk about scenarios and she does live in the real world because obviously over the years she's advised on a number of things which have been imperfect. So she comes with all of that knowledge about, you know, the imperfect world within which we operate. And then, so following that, then, sorry, it's in my report, Roger. Yes, but it's yes, it's Wednesday the 28th of June and Monday the 10th of July. Wednesday 28th, Monday 10th. First is in person, second is online, but it's the same content. And we will put something else in if we've got a stampede and we need another date. We will put more in. But obviously, the Worcestershire Monitoring Officer Group recommend that then individual councils may wish to provide further bespoke training. I've suggested, for example, social media masterclass or serving on outside bodies. So I think there's something for us to think about what else we think might usefully supplement that general refresher overview. And I'm going to pause there because the last point is about dispensations, which is something a little bit different. So I'll pause there on guidance, code, member training, and just see if we've got any questions on that.
Thank you. Yeah. Do we have any questions or comments on the report to note? Yes.
It's an observation or a comment really rather than a question, but when you spoke about addresses and not declaring addresses, I thought it's very poor reflection on our society today. And I then went on, my mind then sort of wandered on to think that, you know, one of the most important things I've always believed is that the local councillor lives in the area that he or she represents. And without the addresses being known, it's quite difficult to validate that. And I feel that that is a loss to local democracy. Just an opinion.
I suppose it comes down to all rights being balanced, doesn't it? I suppose when the legislative framework was put in place, there was a view that there was a need for that high level of local visibility. But nowadays that needs to be balanced against the right that councillors have to be safe. And as we established when we did the personal safety training session, and I mean, perhaps we should look to run it again. When you're serving as a councillor, that is your place of work. Even if you're out knocking doors, it's still the Health and Safety at Work Act covers you. And as you say, it is a sad indictment, but there is an awful lot of examples of where councils have had to step in and react to feelings that their councillors aren't safe. And the Local Government Association is running a campaign about civility in public life. And they talk quite a lot about the safety of councillors. Interesting point about changes between our code and the new code. One of the points where the new code is strong and protective of councillors is it says, if somebody's threatening you, getting into a spat with you or being hostile and threatening, you can block them, or that's a reason for not engaging with them. And it won't make you disrespectful if you do that. You know, as a protective measure. So unfortunately, I think things have moved on. I mean, there would still be a right for people to put their public address on the record if they want to. But as you know, there's no obligation for people now to live in the ward that they represent. So there's no sort of legal necessity. No.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I mean, it's just really perhaps echoing the point I made earlier on. Page and of the LGA code, and it's on their page, well, in the pack, in the appendix, page 27 and page 28, which I think summarises very neatly what the point I'm trying to get over, which I hope would be included in any training, because it's not just that members can and do make complaints about members. It's members making complaints about other members, which I think in most cases is rather childish, because it's not their role, but they do it. And it is, I think, they look for a hook, as I was saying. The hook is disrespectful. And the report quite rightly says, it is subjective and difficult to define. But it then goes on page 28, where it says, is the respect provision of the code a gag on councillors? I think some councillors would like it to be on other councillors, but it does say, the code is not intended to stifle the expressions of passion and frustration that often accompany discussions about local authority business. And that, Chair, is the point I'm trying to get over. And I do think it needs emphasising. Otherwise, officers are going to continue to waste a lot of their time on things which are entirely political, and all members need to grow up and use that in the political arena, not use a code to try and get at their opponents, which is happening all too often, and I think with greater frequency than it ever has before. And I think that must stop.
Always defer to my colleagues. I think he once worked for the Ombudsman at one time.
I did.
Yeah.
Oh,
But I would suggest that what is being talked about isn't a code of practice, it's culture. And you can't capture a culture in a code of practice.
I just add one qualification to the freedom of expression is the enhanced rights are in relation to political debate. And the case of Heatham, which we have looked at before as a committee, acknowledges that there is a power differential between councillors and particularly junior officers, and that you cannot be considered to have an Article 10 unfettered right of discretion if you are criticising junior officers who are simply doing their job. So there's a lot of nuance to Article 10 when it applies, when it doesn't apply. So absolutely, the training is going to cover this, and it's on our menu is Article 10, absolutely. But I'd give you my classic legal answer. It depends, and it is not a carte blanche. But in the political arena, for robust political debate between political opponents, that is absolutely Article 10 territory.
Councillor Amos, thank you. Yeah, and I feel quite confident when we do have the training, and I'm pleased to all, particularly being from Standard, lead the way. Yeah, all points will be covered, including that, and covered quite well. Thank you. Do we have any more comments or questions on those? No. So are we all happy to?
Just come on to the last one then.
Yes. Oh, okay. Let's do all three together. Thank you.
So then the last one is a different matter. Again, with my umbrella approach, I could have put this on a separate paper. Again, a function of the Localism Act is, as you're all aware of, is the process for disclosing interests. The Localism Act is particularly interested in pecuniary interests, which are financial interests. And the Localism Act created a criminal offence for failure to disclose and act appropriately on a financial pecuniary interest. And in fact, we were talking earlier about the Nolan Committee giving recommendations to government response. The Nolan Committee said, we think that's a bit harsh. Can we have that sort of tempered, because it's kind of getting at the wrong things. And the government have said, we don't want to change the legislation for the time being. So we still have, you as members need to be careful in terms of financial interests. And it's my responsibility to help protect you by giving you advice, but I'm not allowed to tell you what to do. Again, that's a function of the code and the Localism Act. I'm to give you advice. And so recognising that as the kind of legislative background, then the drafts people putting the Localism Act together, who presumably were long-standing local government bods, also recognise that there are times when councillors need to vote on financial matters, because if they can't, then a vote can't be put through. And the case in point is voting for a member allowances scheme. That's an obvious candidate. And that happens to us once a year, because at our council we choose to vote the allowances scheme through annually. We're not required to, we could put that on a cycle, but we at this council have chosen to do that annually. So anyway, so the process for being able to vote on something that you otherwise have a pecuniary interest in is called getting a dispensation from the pecuniary interest regime. And there are two ways to get a dispensation under the Localism Act. You can be granted a general dispensation, so it's a sort of block exemption, or you as an individual can approach the monitoring officer and standards committee and ask for a specific dispensation on your matter. And again, you know, really putting this on the record for transparency, I thought it was time we brought this back. And the standard set of dispensations, the block dispensations, they are sort of standard fare. So if you go researching what other councils do, you will see the examples that I've put in at 7.4, determining an allowance. Housing matters, as long as the housing matter where a member holds a tenancy or lease with the council, so they're the recipient, as long as the matter does not relate to the particular tenancy or lease of the member. So general housing policy, if you are a social housing tenant of the council's. Housing benefit, where the councillor receives housing benefit. Any ceremonial honours given to members, setting the council tax or preset, setting a local government tax reduction scheme, matters relating to the local government pension scheme, because a number of our councillors have legacy membership of the LGPS. So those are, you know, standard dispensations. What we have done at Worcester is grant those as we've gone along, but there's been, when I look back through the records, I couldn't see the last time we had a standing order in place putting the dispensations, the general ones, on record. And when I first joined the council 4 years ago, I found that with indemnities as well, I found that we didn't have a standing indemnity resolution. And the risk of not having a standard resolution on something like this is then we always have to remember to do it before the item comes up. And so the Localism Act permits us to grant these block dispensations for up to 4 years. So my recommendation is that we do recommend to council that these are granted for the 4 years. But that doesn't then cut across anything else where an individual needs to, wishes to request a dispensation. So if I just then come on to that, that isn't a wholly discretionary exercise. Dispensations may be sought where, without a dispensation, for example, I've put this in the report at 7.3, this comes from the Localism Act, without a dispensation, the representation of different political groups would be so upset as to alter the outcome of any vote, so it would fundamentally undermine political balance. The dispensation is in the interests of persons generally living in the area. There's one for executive arrangements which doesn't apply, and then you've got your catch-all, it's otherwise appropriate to grant a dispensation. So the council doesn't have a track record of regularly granting dispensations, but there could be something that's considered at a specific committee or council where too many people, measured against any of these indices of what's too many people, could be caught, and we may properly need to consider a dispensation, but that would be exceptional. The process for doing that would be referral to the monitoring officer. I've suggested in consultation with the chair and vice chair the standards committee, because that's in practice how we've been doing things. And because standards committee doesn't meet that regularly, we can't convene a committee, a standard subcommittee, every time we get close to an item, because ordinarily there isn't enough notice to do that. So instead, it sits with the monitoring officer, which is consistent with the Localism Act, but it's in consultation with the chair and vice chair of standards committee. And then we can report back here what dispensations have been granted. So that's it. So as far as today goes, I'm only recommending that we grant those block dispensations, which are of hopefully an uncontentious list. I'm not proposing anything else.
Sean, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think it's very helpful to have elided these two concepts, declaration of interest and dispensation. And can I just press Ms. Stroud on one? If I recall correctly, and I think I do, at a recent, I don't know how recent it was, but at previous council meetings, full council meetings, a general dispensation was given to members who are landlords. I have no objection, no problem at all with any council being a landlord. It's perfectly legitimate, it's fine. But I was just a bit concerned because clearly in granting dispensation on those grounds, members clearly they must have had a financial interest as a landlord if we were discussing housing matters, because by definition, they are landlords of those properties we're discussing. So I was concerned that there was a dispensation on those grounds. I don't know how many members are landlords, and I have no problem or dispute with any of them. But just because, I don't know, Ms Stroud may know the exact number, whether it's 8 or 9, to give a dispensation on those grounds, and then the members participate and vote as though they didn't have an interest when they clearly do. I think there were too many cross currents. I mentioned to Ms Stroud before, it bothered me a bit that was happening or could happen. So therefore, but when I looked at the list, being a landlord was not one of the dispensations. So either we've changed that, which is good, or if we haven't changed it, it's not in the list. So perhaps you could just clarify that, Chair.
The list proposes a set of general dispensations. In relation to landlord ownership, I haven't put anything in there. I haven't seen that elsewhere in my researches. Therefore, that would be a candidate for individual applications. Now, most recently, so there's a good handful of people across the council who are landlords, and people have declared that quite properly in their register. So give you a very recent example. We were looking at a policy through a motion at full council. But the assessment as the item was published and statutory officers had time to think about it, we drilled down from the number of overall landlords impacted to those particular landlords that would be impacted by the policy change, and that then became a very low number. I did consult chair and vice chair. Neither of them wished to grant a dispensation, and they both challenged and said that they didn't think that was the appropriate route. And because the number had become so low, so it wasn't the whole landlord cohort, it was a subset, I provided advice that members needed to declare an interest and not take part in the debate. So we didn't go down the dispensation route. So going back further, there has been occasion where a whole cohort of landlords have been impacted by something at a particular committee, where again, the membership of the committee is a smaller cohort than the membership of full council. Well, another way to do this is to be better sighted and more fleet of foot, myself included, and promptly advise people that they may wish to think about substitutions between the time that the committee papers are published and the time of the meeting. But I can't rule out the possibility that, you know, a cohort of landlords per se might be quite heavily represented on a particular committee. And then we would need to look at this and decide if it was appropriate, if the matter could be managed in a different way and so forth. So hopefully that provides some clarity.
That's a very helpful, Chair. But obviously, Ms Stroud has provided the solution, which is substitutes, which we do on regularly on all committees. But would she agree that if there were a general dispensation on that committee because of the number, in this case of landlords, it could be another category of councillors, but just on that, then there would in fact be this conflict between having the dispensation and having a pecuniary interest. That's what concerns me. In order to solve one problem, there is another problem still there.
So I suppose terminology, the general dispensations are this sort of standing list. Anything else would be a specific dispensation that would only relate to that meeting. And we would have to determine, monitoring officer with advice of chair and vice chair, whether it was appropriate to grant it. And so that goes to the heart of your point about whether it is appropriate. So obviously I can't sort of, everything depends on the circumstances. I can't sort of sit here and rule that it would never be appropriate. But obviously, if there were ways to avoid that situation arising, then those are things we would explore. But that wouldn't be a general, that would be a specific dispensation for an item at a meeting, and it would be a very tailored discussion.
Councillor Amos, thank you. Does anyone else have any other comments or questions around? And I think hopefully everyone can get some assurance from the areas in 7.4, which Sean has highlighted. They're very generic, and other matters would, whilst we can't guarantee everything, are quite specific. So I think if on that basis we're happy to agree that block dispensations, but nothing further. Agreed, yes. Thank you. Right. So we've got agenda item 9. Those are the procedures for investigation and assessment of member code of conduct complaints. And we have a revised procedure which Sian will take us through again. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so this is the last big bundle of papers for tonight. So the procedures that the Council operates for the assessment investigation of complaints sit under the Localism Act. The Localism Act doesn't prescribe what procedures you should follow, but some elements are ascertainable from the legislation, the involvement of the monitoring officer and a designated independent person for standards. Other elements, I've said, are necessarily implied by virtue of the right to a fair hearing and so forth. The Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, who doesn't have jurisdiction over members' complaints but can look at fair processes, has criticised a local authority, Tainbridge District Council in Surrey, I think it is, over their failure to follow a reasonable procedure in the investigation of a councillor code of conduct complaint. And I've already referred to a January case where the High Court ruled that there was inequality in treatment between two councillors subject to the code of conduct investigation. So for all of those reasons, and the fact that our procedures were adopted in 2014 and last amended in 2017, it seemed to me that they were due review. And obviously have had the opportunity of using them, not that frequently at this council, but there are always a few things that come through the system. So, you know, we have kind of lived experience from the procedures, both at officer level, independent person level and standard subcommittee level. Helpfully, the Local Government Association has published another massive tome of guidance, 2021, to assist monitoring officers and anyone nominated by them to carry out investigations. So again, for your assurance, I've provided in the pack the LGA's full guidance on running through the assessment stage. Now, what the Localism Act does is distinguish between an assessment stage, an initial assessment, a filter, and then something that should be referred to a hearing. And there are a couple of kind of absolutes that come from the legislation. One is that a complaint will not be proceeded with unless an actual complaint is made. So somebody must be the complainant in order to trigger the process. So that's one absolute. And the other is that there should be this staged process of initial assessment. It's recommended you do that with the independent person. At Worcester, we have always done that with the independent person, and we assess every complaint with the independent person. And then the other absolute is that things should only go to a subcommittee hearing if there are grounds for considering there's been a breach of the code. So those are some of the points of the framework within which any procedure must operate. So, as I say, the LGA guidance is very, very comprehensive. And if you're getting into an investigation where you are taking witness statements and interviewing people, as has been in external parties, then you would want to refer to the detailed guidance or have your subject counsellor, who might find the process quite distressing, refer to the guidance and the independent person to reassure about some of those fair process points about taking statements and writing things up and taking them through. But I didn't feel that level of detail needed to be replicated in our complaints process, because we can refer to the LGA full guidance for more information. Instead, the amendments I've made are to improve some of the points where we've gone and found it ambiguous before. So, for example, to what extent is the complaints process done privately, and to what extent does it reach the public domain? And again, you'll see the LGA doesn't rule on that. It says that councils will decide how much is done privately and how much is done in the public domain. My research is, you may wish to do your own, will demonstrate to you that in the majority of cases, at the end of a standard subcommittee process, so that assumes that there's been grounds for a hearing, in the majority of cases, and the LGA guidance is best practice on this, you should as a council publish a decision notice at the end, whether the complaint was upheld or dismissed. That's a different position to where we are in Worcester, where at the moment everything happens privately end to end, and unless a breach is upheld. So that's one difference. The other area where our current procedure was found light was explaining what would happen in terms of somebody wishing to make an anonymous complaint. And again, consistent with the way that the council would operate a whistleblowing policy or any employment policy, we advise against anonymous complaints. There's this Article 6 point about right to a fair hearing, that if you're the subject of a complaint, you're entitled to know the substance of what's being complained about, so you can prepare your response. And that ordinarily involves knowing who's complained about you, so you can understand the context within which they've made their complaint. So again, we've made it clear that we don't countenance anonymous complaints, but that there may be a degree of confidential information that it may be appropriate to withhold. And all the way through, I've introduced the check and balance of referral to the independent person for a second opinion around the monitoring officers, because I'm acutely aware that this process is unusual in the Localism Act, well, in our processes as being, as sitting so closely as it does with an officer portfolio. So I'm keen that responsibility is a bit more transparently discharged. Then you come on to the initial assessment of a complaint. And again, we need to recognise that the initial assessment stage is very important, because if a complaint shouldn't be progressed, then it's important it's assessed robustly at the initial assessment stage. And a number of councils have done this for some time. Our procedures didn't have a set of criteria against which an initial assessment would be made. So these are derived from the LGA guidance, but again, if you do your own researches, you'll see that this is quite a prevalent list of criteria that you get elsewhere. So in the amended document, we've got these assessment criteria. Is there, prima facie, on the face of it, sufficient evidence of a potential breach? Are there more appropriate remedies that could be explored first? Where the complaint is one councillor against another, a greater allowance for political debate may be given, bearing in mind right to freedom of expression. Is the complaint, in the view of the authority, malicious, politically motivated, tit for tat? Whether an investigation would not be in the public interest, or even if proven, would not be serious enough to warrant any sanction? Substantially similar complaints, conduct in the distant past, the councillor is no longer serving or is seriously ill. So there's a whole list of things there to do an assessment with. But one of the most, I think, helpful changes, at least as far as the monitoring officer and the independent person was concerned, would be the opportunity to refer that initial assessment stage to a subcommittee. So obviously under the Act, it would still be for the monitoring officer to advise on initial assessment and ultimately rule on it. But to do that instead on a particularly sensitive or recurrent matter in consultation with a standard subcommittee, which shall receive advice from the monitoring officer and independent person. So I would just need to make that clear that ultimately under the Act, it would still need to be my determination. But the reason for doing that is partly around this perception of fairness. And I think that where you have something that comes through the system and it may be bound up in something bigger, or it may be something that comes repeated, certainly I would benefit the opportunity for that to be exposed to the standard subcommittee at an earlier stage, who would need to apply the criteria, and ultimately I would need to give advice then and make a determination based on the input of that subcommittee. So thinking about it, I might just need to rephrase it so it's clear that ultimately it would still be an MO determination, but in consultation with the standard subcommittee. But that would be a step of, if you like, internal transparency that we don't have at the moment, and I think that would be helpful. And it wouldn't be that you do that for every complaint, but it would be where something is sensitive and you may have a feeling based on previous complaints about how it might best be dealt with, but you want there to be some rigour in the process as to how you get there. And I think those are the main amendments, aren't they?
Have I got that right?
Presently, we don't.
So, yeah, fine, okay.
And
It's
the proposal is to introduce it.
But if the panel system if I understand it, the panel system, for instance, doesn't give a vote to a parish council member or a lay member, according to what's in the guidance.
Yes, our standard subcommittee isn't drawn from that wider membership. Yeah. We could look at that. We could look at, the role of an independent member, separate from the independent person. I think those are the main changes, because I've mentioned the point about confidentiality. The whole process will still be dealt with in confidence until there is the outcome of a full hearing. So instead of a stage before a full hearing, which hasn't been robustly tested through evidence, a notice would only be published at the end of a subcommittee hearing, a full subcommittee hearing, if that happened. And then I've just changed our procedures for the actual subcommittee hearings because they sat on the back of our complaints procedures and they were rigid. So rather than have a set of procedures about who speaks in what order, I've said instead that we would adhere to public law principles. There would be some, some inalienable rights, like rights to speak, subject counsellor, be accompanied, right to complainant, so forth. But ultimately, the chair will need to manage the business of that subcommittee meeting like any other. So those are the changes, and hopefully I've talked you through the rationale for them. So they can be, this is a local procedure, it's not, it doesn't need to go up to full council, so we can take a view on that tonight, Chair.
Sean, yeah, thank you for the detail. And I think in summary, we're obviously looking at a complaint must be a complaint. Anonymous complaints aren't really appropriate. And then we're looking to be more transparent by involving the subcommittee in the initial stages. And then following on from that, just to emphasise, it is still obviously the monitoring officer decision. And also for the subcommittee hearings to have a less rigid framework, but it will still be as robust, but not as sort of set down a certain path and order which you must talk through. But yeah, does anyone have comments, thoughts, questions? Yeah, okay, Councillor Amos and then Councillor Stanley. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to reinforce that point about anonymity. I think there is an important principle here of natural justice. I think it's wholly inappropriate. I wouldn't say it's not desirable. I would say it's wholly inappropriate for somebody to manufacture a complaint under the guise of anonymity. Why would it be anonymous? Obviously, we're not talking about a whistleblowing policy, which we've dealt with on the Audit and Governance Committee that I chair. We've looked at that and we're aware of that. But this is somebody making a conscious decision to make a complaint about a member. They wish to remain anonymous. So I think I would really like to see the wording on that much toughened. There would have to be extraordinary, exceptional circumstances for that to take place, because it goes against natural justice, and that is a principle of somebody's human rights. So that is pretty powerful, like Section 10. The other thing, Chair, I would urge caution, or perhaps a rethink or a pause for thought on the idea of a subcommittee, because I think my fear is a very simple one, and it's a point of principle I expressed very early on, which is about politicians sitting in judgment on other politicians about what they've said, because they are politicians, and I'm one. The question is, to what extent can they be utterly impartial or objective? I mean, clearly, when it comes to things like planning and licensing, we have to be there, because there are tests, because it's quasi-judicial. But this process is not quasi-judicial, it is subjective. And my fear would be that, well, there's a subcommittee of 3, so it's either 2 of my lot, 1 of your lot, or 2 of your lot, 1 of my lot. And I really do think it needs to be thought through seriously, because if you get kind of tit for tat, that is just the sort of thing I'm trying to avoid, because it's a waste of officers' time, frankly, and it goes nowhere. The public don't want it. The public aren't interested in us politicians squabbling amongst each other and using a code of conduct as a means to do it. They're not interested. They think public money should be better spent, and they're absolutely right. So I would urge caution on that, Chair. If you set up a subcommittee, it is politicians judging others. None of us is whiter than white or perfect, but unless there are very clear objective criteria, but if there are very clear objective criteria, then I don't see why you need politicians to do it. However, I rest my case, but I fear if we're not very careful, I should be back here and telling you, I told you so. I think it's quite an innovation, but just think through the ramifications, Chair.
Yeah, Councillor Amos, thank you. And I think I will just add to that. Obviously, with this process, we still have the code of conduct, we have all the guidance, and the final decision would be that of the monitoring officer, and we have our independent person, so there are some controls there, obviously. But yeah, but Councillor Stanley, you wanted to?
Chair, thanks very much. I just wanted to touch on, if we may, the question of those members who sit in other authorities. The document alludes to those who have no longer perhaps on one level and still continue at another level. But how closely aligned are the frameworks to make this a really effective, you're dealing with essentially, I'm not referring to them as courts of law, but I will just for a descriptive purpose. How closely aligned do they need to be, and are they?
I'll just respond to that point first, Councillor Stanley. So it's not me. We can only consider things within our jurisdiction. I know this is obvious, but where it's however many hats they've got, wherever it's a councillor doing Worcester City Council business, that's when this would apply. And our codes are very, very closely aligned, as we were talking about earlier. And the processes followed are very, very similar. But we would only be considering something that related to a Worcester City Councillor, current or former. And that's obviously one of the criteria is, do you want to consider it if someone's no longer a councillor?
Actually, Chair, I think Councillor Stanley made a very valid point. Certainly on the county council, quite a lot, I think a very large majority are actually dual hatters. So through you, Chair, asking Ms. Stroud, the very simple scenario, a member of a district council, including city council, is found to have done something wrong. Would it then be possible for people, say, just for example, at county council to say, well, you've done something wrong, you've been found guilty at your district or county, therefore we are going to, that would not be a secretary, that would definitely be a non-secretary, and the monitoring officer of the county would say, well, no, you can't have two bites of the cherry.
Just in answer to that specific question, the start of the code is all about when you're acting in your capacity as. So it's very specific to which capacity are you acting in. So a complaint must relate under this to you acting in your capacity as a councillor at Worcester City Council. And that's the end of the jurisdiction. And there would be no grounds for somebody at county to pursue that because it wouldn't relate to you in your capacity as a county councillor.
Come back on something that Alan's just said. I mean, I've sat on subcommittees several times, and it's perfectly possible for me to be two things. We can be two things. I'm both a party politician, but I'm also a councillor who serves the council. And I've sat on subcommittees, and I can speak for myself. I take that job very, very seriously. And when I'm faced with evidence to read through and make a decision about whether a councillor has breached the code of conduct, I certainly don't see myself as I'm a Labour councillor, that person's a Tory councillor, and therefore I'm going to be biased against them. It's probably one of the roles I take most seriously. I take all my roles as a councillor seriously, but sitting on a subcommittee I take extremely seriously, and I go through the evidence and I read it very carefully, and I certainly wouldn't judge someone based on their party political allegiance. So, I mean, if we're not going to do it, then who is? Who is going to be judge and jury? And I would rather it done by my fellow councillors than someone who isn't a councillor or unelected or has got no authority or legitimacy, to be honest with you. So I don't quite see the issue personally. What's different to what we have now when subcommittees made up of 3 councillors go through the evidence, question those who've been accused, give them the opportunity to set forward their defence, and then make a decision based on what we've read. I don't think that there's any problem there, personally, from my experience of gone through the process several times.
I've sat with Matt a few times and I can vouch for his impartiality. The only thing I would say, Matt, that the way the process works, the rules are that we have to be so confident in the procedure and the people who are here in the case that there's no appeal. So I just stress how important it is for the right people to be on the panel. You wouldn't want the serial transgressors or the serial complainers.
Do you have any more comments or questions? Yeah, Faye, would you like to say a few words? Be helpful.
On the question of anonymity, I'd find it quite difficult to assess a complaint if I didn't know who was making the complaint. That'd be really difficult. On the other thing, there are often complaints which are borderline. They're almost a potential breach, but not quite. And I think to myself, I shouldn't put that to a subcommittee because it's not really a clear-cut breach. And it would be useful to have another opinion apart from the monitor officer and myself about that. Okay, if there are 4 people, it's still the monitoring officer that decides what should be done. But I think it's useful to have additional opinions at that stage.
Thank you. Any further comments or questions? No? So I think based on that, are we happy to approve the revised procedures? Howard, yes? Whichever. Okay, thank you. So that takes us to item 10, and I think, do we just circulate? It's the register of...
Yes, it's
just circulated at the end. So it's please help yourself, and we'll pass it round. And any other business? I've not got any other business. I think so. Yep, I hereby thank you for going through all the legal documents. And yeah, meeting closed. Thank you.